Good evening, everyone. I'm Lady Nopeingham. Tonight's video is a compilation of 5 of my previous videos. Catoptrophobia, a creepypasta about a frightful fear of mirrors. Deep in the Bowels by shade of DarkLittleVoices. Santa Saved Me, the incredible Christmas creepypasta by Paige Turner. New Year, New Me, featuring 2 stories about cherishing the life you have before it's gone. And Don't Fuck with Tessa, including 3 stories of women on the hunt for blood, revenge, and freedom. Special thanks go out to all of the authors and guest voices in tonight's compilation, including those already mentioned, as well as Nightmare's Edge, Stache, Steve Stockton, Dr. Plague, and Reddit users OK Organization 2296, ChaoticSerenity, and BeeIsBack. All links will be included in the description. Please take a moment to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy my content. It really would mean the world to me. Now, let's get into the stories. Have a great night, everyone. Catoptrophobia. That's what I had. A genuine fear of mirrors. Trust me, it sucked. It wasn't that whenever I saw a mirror I ran screaming in the opposite direction. My phobia was slightly more subtle than that. For example, if I was alone in my room and I turned away from the mirror on my wall, I could not look at it again. The thought of doing so was so terrifying that it was almost paralyzing. But I didn't always have this fear, unlike my fear of spiders and injections that I had had for as long as I could remember. My fear of mirrors developed in my early teens, shortly before I turned 14, under slightly more unusual circumstances than the possible reasons that various websites and books will give you. When I was 14, my parents had treated me to a redecorated room, and I leapt at the chance to be rid of the color combination that 7-year-old me had decided on. The once pink walls were repainted to a pale blue. The furniture was mostly the same: wooden bunk bed and wardrobe. My sofa bed had been replaced with a desk that matched the wood of the other furniture, and there was a new mirror hanging on the wall. I didn't like the desk because I loved my sofa bed. There were so many memories of sleepovers and games like hide-and-seek linked to it, and when I was little and too scared of the shadows on my bunk, I would simply not climb it and sleep on the sofa bed instead, with the cat curled up next to me. I liked the mirror, though. My original mirror was going into my little brother's room, but I didn't have any particular attachment to it. I'd rather he had taken the sofa bed, so it wouldn't have had to been thrown away. The desk was new and from IKEA, but the mirror had been bought at a very reasonable price in a charity shop. I remember walking into the shop, initially looking for a cheap TV. But then I saw the mirror hanging on the far end of the big, well-lit room, and all thoughts of a TV were forgotten. I bought the mirror without a moment's hesitation. It was beautiful, and I knew instantly that I wanted it. It was an oval shape and pretty old, maybe from Victorian times, or possibly even earlier. The metal frame holding the polished glass was a dark gold, the metal artfully shaped into beautifully woven vines and flowers. The mirror glass itself was bright and shining, without a single smudge or mark. I hung it up very happily that same day, and the moment I saw the reflection of my new sky blue, fancy grown-up room, it somehow felt complete. I was proud of my new room. It made me feel grown up. The last of my stuffed toys had gone to little cousins, and the cutesy pink color scheme was replaced with a calm blue. I admit to being a pretty arrogant teen, but come on, a new bedroom is something exciting, especially if it doesn't happen often. Pretty much immediately after my room was redone, the half-term holidays began. This meant that for the majority of the following week, I was out with friends, and usually we would all spend the night at someone else's house, to the extent that throughout the half-term I spent a total of 2 nights in my own home, and one of those was in the living room, because we couldn't all fit into my bedroom. The second night that I spent at home was the last one before school started again. I was exhausted from all of the nights staying awake at least until the sun came up, and so I had gone to bed much earlier than normal. But despite my sleep deprivation, actually going to sleep was beyond me. I tossed and turned before sneaking into my brother's room and borrowing his iPod so the music would calm me enough to sleep. That was the night I had the first nightmare. Although I was scared of a pretty wide variety of things, especially as a child, nightmares were not common. I was in my room facing my mirror. I can't remember what exactly I was doing, maybe brushing my hair, putting on makeup, something along those lines. Something where I had to look very closely at the mirror and stand close to it, blocking out the view of what was behind me. I then dropped whatever I was holding, bent down to pick it up, straightened, looked back at the mirror and froze as I noticed the girl standing behind me. She was young, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with shiny, dark hair that fell just past her shoulder blades in loose waves. She was wearing a white lace dress, embroidered with little flowers, and her skin was so pale that it nearly matched the dress. Her features were delicate, small nose, thin pink lips that were twisted into a shy smile. I couldn't see her eyes, though. They were covered by a black, stained blindfold. A trickle of red dripped from the dark material onto the girl's snow-white skin, creeping down her cheek like a tear. She smiled. I woke up in a cold sweat, breathing hard and fast, filled with a terrible sense of dread. The funny thing about dreams is that you sometimes know things that you had no way of knowing, like when you're in a big house and you know exactly where to go and which doors lead to which rooms, even though you've never seen the house before in your life. Well, in this dream, I also knew something I had no way of knowing. A terrible certainty that if that blindfold ever came off, if I ever saw that little girl's eyes, I would be dead. I got up and got dressed without glancing at the mirror once. I darted out of my room as quickly as I could, deciding against wearing makeup that day. The idea of standing in front of a mirror and staring directly at it, just like in my nightmare, was not exactly appealing. I stayed quiet throughout most of the school day before deciding on going home at lunchtime, feigning sickness. I wouldn't be able to focus on any of the lessons anyway. Mom came to pick me up, looking concerned at the dark shadows under my eyes and the fact that I fell asleep in the car. I slept for the entire afternoon, eventually waking up when my dad and brother came home. I joined them for dinner, finished my homework, and then curled up with my parents to watch a film after my brother had gone to bed. It was a horror film, The Conjuring. I couldn't take it and quickly lied, saying that my headache had come back before rushing to the safety of my room and bed. I was shaking. I had seen the film before, and it hadn't really scared me. Horror films and stories had never really bothered me, despite my many childhood fears. I regularly read horror stories that people posted online, played horror games, and would stay up late to watch films with my parents and friends. It wasn't the witch who hung herself who scared me, or the Annabelle doll, or the maid who does that horrible jump scare. It was the little boy in the mirror who made my blood run cold, who made me start to tremble and fear turning around because of what I might see. I crawled into my bed and lay there, under the blankets, shaking. The mirror was opposite my bed. I stayed awake for what seemed like hours, staring at the mirror, not daring to close my eyes and fearing every blink until finally sleep claimed me. I had the same dream as the night before. I dropped something, picked it up, the little girl behind me, fear, blindfold, drop of red on white, smile, and wake up in a cold sweat. The only difference was that this time her blindfold was loose, partially slipping off her face, to the extent that I could just catch a glimpse of long, dark eyelashes. I gasped for breath and buried my face in my hands, trying not to cry. I didn't want my family to see me like this. It would just provoke questions and sympathy that I didn't want to deal with right now. I didn't like it when my family tried to get involved with my problems. I don't know why. It just made me angry whenever they did it, and they just seemed to get in the way when I tried to fix things. Don't get me wrong, I loved them very much, but this was definitely among the many things that I did not want to share with them. I lay awake for the rest of the night, too terrified to go to sleep, in case I saw the girl and her eyes would be open. I didn't want to die. I'd heard somewhere that if you die in your dreams, you die in real life too. I had never believed this, but now I didn't want to find out. Mom kept me home the next day. I had a fever and couldn't stop shaking, and apparently I looked awful. I didn't want to look in the mirror to check. I spent the day sleeping. During the day, I could sleep just fine, which was extremely helpful considering the fact I still had to go to school, nightmares or not. This whole thing couldn't have happened in the holidays, where I actually had the possibility of becoming nocturnal, could it? I woke up at 4 p.m. and stumbled downstairs to get something to eat. Mom had gone out to get new school shoes for my brother, who was currently at a friend's house, and Dad was working late. I curled up on the sofa with our cat, Phoebe, on my lap, a pot of chocolate and hazelnut ice cream in my hand, and turned on my laptop. Fear of mirrors, I mumbled around a spoonful of ice cream as I typed. I frowned at the results. Why do phobias always have to have awkward names? Catoptrophobia. There we go. I ignored the image results. Honestly, that's just cruel. And opened a site I had never heard of before, since Wikipedia told me little besides possible causes and treatments. Apparently, the fear of mirrors is ancient and can be traced back to man's fear of still waters. Before mirrors, people saw their reflections in lakes and ponds, as those were the only options. People genuinely believed that it was their souls staring back at them. Creepy. This created the idea that your soul could be separated from you before your death. No way is that little girl my soul. That was a whole new level of horrifying that I didn't even want to consider. There are lots of myths, legends, and folklores around this idea of the soul being torn away from its body. Some African tribes avoided still water because they believed that their souls could be stolen by crocodiles and evil spirits who could eat, destroy, or steal their reflections, which were actually their souls. There are stories where if a person's reflection is disturbed, then it meant they were doomed or would suffer an impending disaster. Babies weren't shown their reflections out of fear that it would kill them, and the idea that a broken mirror brings 7 years of bad luck still exists today. Damn, why did we create things that we're so scared of? If lakes and rivers were already scary, why create something that means you can see your reflection perfectly and constantly? I switched off the computer and stroked Phoebe's tortoiseshell fur. She purred quietly and rubbed her head against my hand. I smiled as she curled up on my stomach, and gradually, we both fell asleep. I'm standing in front of the mirror in the bathroom. She is behind me, standing on top of the washing basket, so I can clearly see her in the mirror. Her blindfold is gone, but her eyes are closed. She has long, dark eyelashes, and her eyebrows are tilted upward slightly, her small pink mouth twisted into a little smile. The picture of innocence. There's something weird about the way her eyelids fall, something odd that I can't put my finger on. Her eyelids twitch and her eyebrows twist into a small frown, the smile turning into a slight grimace. Her eyelids twitch again, and again, and then start to open. I cried out as I felt a sharp pain in my chest, sitting up straight, gasping for air and certain that the little girl would be standing in front of me, eyes open, prepared to kill me. But it wasn't the girl in front of me. It was Phoebe, staring at me with unflinching green eyes, her fur all puffed up, the way it was whenever a dog got too close. The skin on my chest was burning. I raised my hands to touch it, and brought my fingers away bloody. There were 2 sets of deep cat scratches on my skin. Phoebe had woken me up. I held out my hand, clicking my tongue slightly, and she hesitantly walked towards me, sniffed my hand, and rubbed her head against it, purring again. I smiled and whispered, "Thank you." For the next 7 days I had the same dream. The girl would be standing behind me, her eyes would begin to open, and Phoebe would wake me up. The little tortoiseshell cat slept on my stomach every night, and rarely left my side while I was at home. She even tried to follow me to school once. We were halfway down the road when I realized she had snuck into the car and was hiding under my seat. Both of my parents found this highly amusing and suspected me of buying cat treats or sneaking food off the table for her. Both of these things I had actually done on many occasions. We'd had Phoebe since I was 2 years old. I couldn't remember a time when she wasn't around, and I absolutely loved her. The whole family did. But me especially. I basically grew up with her. Granted, she was getting a bit old for a cat, and she was grumpy, and she dribbled a bit when she was dozing, especially if she's sitting on someone. And she brought in dead worms because she couldn't catch birds or mice very well anymore. But she was brave, usually tolerant of everything, even my little brother, who had grasped the concept of be gentle and quiet around animals or you'll scare them pretty late, and she knew that I needed her. The girl's face was getting more and more twisted in my dreams. Once, I dreamt that her small mouth was twisted into a wide, manic grin, revealing sharp little teeth. Her snake-like tongue flicked over her teeth as her eyelids twitched and started to raise, just as little razor claws sank into my skin, pulling me to reality. She really, really scared me. I hate to admit it, but this small 8-year-old girl scared the shit out of me. She would haunt my every thought. For my art project, I drew the model looking into a mirror with something completely different reflected in the glass. For history, I researched man's earliest fears and did a presentation on it, A+, by the way, and my school books were filled with doodles of lace dresses and blindfolds. They must have looked so damn creepy when the teachers looked through my work, now that I think about it. In my dreams, the only thing that really changed were the mirrors that I was looking into. There were a total of 6 mirrors in my house. 1 in my room, 1 in my parents' room, 1 in my brother's room, 1 in the bathroom, 1 in the hallway, and 1 in the entrance hall. Don't ask me why we needed the last 2. I think my parents just liked the way they looked, the way they made the room feel bigger. Most of the nightmares were located in my room, but over that period of time, every mirror in my house was turned into something I should learn to fear. The symptoms of my phobia also became slightly more profound. My breathing would become shallow. My heart would pound at a rate that was far from normal. I would start shaking and sweating, and once, when I saw a shadow flicker and move out of the corner of my eye in the bathroom mirror, it caused a full-blown panic attack. Thankfully, my parents weren't home. I still wasn't ready to share this with them. I don't think I ever will be. But Phoebe was there, by my side. She curled up against me, her little body pressed against mine, purring, comforting me as I sobbed and shook and gasped for breath. The weekend came and went. I spent the days sleeping, saying that I was sick, and the nights I spent watching live streams, playing video games, drawing, reading, doing homework, research on the most ridiculous and random of topics, writing stories, anything to distract me from the mirror. Monday followed the same events as the previous week. I would go to sleep, and Phoebe woke me up whenever she needed to. I would go to school, come home, and immediately try to snatch some sleep while there was still daylight. I dreaded winter. The days were already getting shorter. Soon it would be dark before I even got home from school. Tuesday was a bad day. I stumbled into school, exhausted as usual, barely scraped through my classes, taking just enough notes that I would be able to catch up Friday and Saturday nights. My social life had long since disappeared. Seriously, who has the energy to deal with all that drama? I got home and immediately noticed something was wrong. Where was Phoebe? I asked Mum if she had seen her, and she simply laughed and replied, "Are you sure you didn't leave her in school by accident?" I laughed and agreed that it was probably what happened, trying not to betray my internal panic. Where the hell is she? I didn't go to sleep as I normally did that afternoon. Instead, I searched the house and the surrounding streets. Where is my cat? My panic was rising and threatening to choke me. My imagination was conjuring up thought after thought of what could have happened to her. What would happen to me if she were really gone? "She's dead," whispered a treacherous little voice in the back of my mind. "She's dead. You're never going to find her. And you're going to be dead as well as soon as it gets dark." It actually was getting dark. I had spent the entire evening out looking for Phoebe, and I hadn't found her. I walked home, numb initially, but once I got in the door, I burst into tears. Mum was at my side instantly, holding me close and whispering that it would be okay, that she was in a better place, that she had had a good life, and all the usual stuff that kids are told when a beloved pet dies. But none of this was comforting to me. She had been there forever, and I was lost without her, probably quite literally, once I fell asleep. My bedtime came and went. My parents were unusually understanding, especially considering that it was a school night, but they were sympathetic. They had loved Phoebe as well, but knew how close the two of us had been. The phrase, "a dog is a man's best friend," didn't apply to us. But as the evening wore on, they finally insisted that I go to sleep. My cat vanishing wasn't a good enough excuse for me to miss school the next day, especially considering how many days I had already missed in the past week. I walked to my room, subdued. I felt like I was walking to the gallows or execution block. My windows were open. I hadn't left them like that, but my numbness meant that it didn't register for quite a while. I was about to pull the windows shut when something caught my eye. It was pretty alarming to see my wardrobe door wide open, with all the clothes strewn on the floor and a white lace dress embroidered with flowers hanging inside. Oddly enough, this dress looked like it would fit someone my size, but I didn't even own any dresses, let alone a vintage-looking white lace one. I had read enough horror stories that contained creepy things in wardrobes to just leave it be. Seeing as I couldn't exactly burn down my wardrobe, I got the next best thing: duct tape. I don't see why more people don't do this in horror films. I muttered as I taped my wardrobe shut with so many layers of tape that you could barely see the wood anymore. I stepped back, hands on hips, satisfied. Then the grief hit me again, so hard that I doubled over, biting my lips to hide my sobs. My parents thought I was asleep, and I wanted it to stay that way. Tears blurred my vision, and I missed a step on the ladder to my bunk bed and cracked my chin on the wood. I hissed out a stream of curses and crawled into bed, ignoring the metallic taste of blood mingling with mint from my toothpaste. The moment I closed my eyes, I was staring into a mirror. It was the mirror from my room, but I wasn't in my room, or even in my house for that matter. I was standing in quite a small room, with dark wood paneling and old Victorian-style furniture. There was a thick, soft, dark red carpet on the floor. It was then that I realized that my feet were bare. This was odd. Normally, in these dreams, I was wearing whatever I had worn that day, or a random outfit from my own wardrobe. But I wasn't this time. Well, technically I was. I was wearing the white lace dress. Well, technically I was. I was wearing the white lace dress. I felt small, cold hands touch the untied white ribbon around my waist, take hold of it and tie it into a bow, not too tight, not too loose, just right. "It's okay, you'll manage," a quiet voice whispered in my ear. "It's not so bad, I promise." I was no longer standing. I was sitting in an immensely comfortable armchair in front of the mirror. Behind me was the little girl. Her blindfold was off, and I finally saw her eyes for the first time. Or rather, her lack of eyes. Instead of eyeballs, I saw two gaping sockets, weeping blood, red on white. She smiled and ran a brush through my long, dark blonde hair, which hung down and fell over my shoulders down my back. "You have such soft hair. I bet it's really pretty," she grinned, looking delighted as she braided a single small strand that fell over my face. "Why am I here?" I asked, my voice hoarse and irritatingly frightened. The girl's smile faded, and she took my sweating hand in her cold one. I can't take it anymore," she whispered. Her voice was nearly as hoarse as mine. She pulled away and walked out of my line of vision. I couldn't move, though I was desperately trying to turn around to see where she had gone. I heard the distinct, awful sound of metal on metal, like when someone with rings on their fingers runs their hand along a metal banister. I strained to move, to run away, but I couldn't. The little girl walked back into my view, with a silver implement in each hand, a horrifying combination of ice cream scoop and dinner spoon. The ends of both implements were glowing red with heat. I want to be able to see again," she whispered. "I want to see the colors, and the flowers, and the sky." Her voice hitched. "I want to see my mama." A trickle of liquid fell over her cheek, not red this time, but clear, like a tiny diamond. I was so focused on this tiny, sparkling drop that I didn't realize how close she had gotten until I felt the searing pain of unbearable heat. "Shh," a soft voice whispered into my ear. "It doesn't hurt that much now, does it?" I bit my lip and nodded, terrified I would lose more than my sight if I didn't. As I felt a soft material cover my ruined eyes, I heard a comforting voice in my ear, the entire time describing how beautiful the room was and how my hair was just as pretty as it felt. I felt cool hands brush away the wetness on my face. "It's gonna be okay," said a soft, happy voice. "You'll get your sight back eventually, just like I got mine." I heard laughter. Look, she came back for you. She put something soft onto my lap. I heard footsteps moving away. I think she was skipping. Phoebe was purring in my lap. I kissed her head, imagining her sparkling green eyes and the unique coloring of her face, split down the middle, one half brown and the other half black. "Don't worry, Phoebe," I whispered. "I'll get my sight back. It's gonna be okay." I think I was saying this to reassure myself more than the cat, but it was comforting to some degree, like if I promised it to someone, it would have to happen, just to keep the promise. I could see the mirror through the blindfold. The once dark metal now gleamed brilliant gold, acting like a beacon, although I could see absolutely nothing else. Through the glass, I heard the muffled sound of voices, and I could smell that distinct smell of old clothes that belonged to charity shops. And in the gloom of the mirror's glass, I saw a pair of gleaming, glowing eyes. Such a beautiful and vibrant color. Mine. I stroked Phoebe's soft fur and put her on the floor. I could easily locate her via her purring. I ran a hand over the skirt of my dress and through my hair. I had to look nice for when my eyes saw me. The gleaming black pupils landed on me and my breath hitched. They were so beautiful. I needed them. They moved towards the mirror, skirting around furniture that I couldn't see, before stopping and staring, not at me, but at the mirror. The mirror that had caused me so much fear and pain. The mirror that, deep down, still terrified me. My eyes disappeared from the view that the mirror gave me, and were gone for quite some time. I peered around through my little window, desperate to catch another glimpse of them. They came back, admiring the mirror once again. They bought it. Mine. Deep in the Bowels, Extended Edition, by Shade of DarkLittleVoices. The following was posted to a local Sacramento forum on September 3rd, 2023. Please help. I've been searching for my boyfriend, Logan, for at least 3 hours now. He hasn't answered my calls or texts since I convinced him to go see a doctor about his recurrent stomach pains. This whole mess started a few months ago. It started the morning after we went on a date for our anniversary. Logan complained of stomach pain, so naturally, I thought he was just going to throw up, and I, of course, would have to help him clean up. I then suggested to him that if it got worse, he should see a doctor.
It's probably nothing, just something I ate at the restaurant last night. I'll see you when I get home, okay?
I'm in the middle of making breakfast. Aren't you hungry?
No thanks. I feel full somehow. If anything, I'll get something to eat at work.
And with that, he kissed me and tried to assure me that he would be okay. But I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling that something just wasn't right. For starters, I've been dating Logan for well over 5 years, and he's never turned down a meal, especially not breakfast. I tried to tell myself that maybe his stomach is just recovering from whatever it was that he ate on our date last night. Well, it's been months now, and though our anniversary meal had all but faded from memory, my concerns for Logan's health have only increased with time. Logan would eat, but his portions seemed to slowly shrink. Then I began to realize that he barely slept, and he was always complaining about on and off stomach pains. It was getting to the point where I think it was affecting him mentally, because he would get angry and then barely remember why he was upset. He would have no memory of his day at work and easily lose track of whatever task he happened to be working on. Logan, sweetie, maybe you should see a doctor. I'm worried that you haven't been acting right. It's been months, and it doesn't seem to be getting better. It looks like it's getting worse.
I'll be fine, Vicky. It's just an upset stomach. I'll take something later if it gets any worse.
He said, as he held on to his stomach. It was at this point that I was becoming convinced that he was hiding something from me. My mind began to race with so many theories, analyzing recent memories, and coming up with worst-case scenarios that I didn't even register that he was trying to put my mind at ease. At some point, though, I had apparently started an argument with him. I apologized to him and tried to explain that I had just let all my fear hit me all at once. He looked annoyed, but he still hugged me.
I know you're worried, Vicky, but I'll be okay. It's just between the on and off pain in my stomach and work, I haven't been resting as much as I should, okay?
I swallowed my anxiety as I answered him with an okay and a small smile. I don't want to argue with him, it's just that I know how stubborn my boyfriend can be, so I can't help but worry. I love him so much, and I don't want anything bad to happen to him. I wish I could tell you that things got better from there, but they didn't. He began to sulk, he would get tired easier, and he barely seemed to be himself. So, earlier this morning, I finally put my foot down and demanded that he go see a doctor immediately. He protested a bit, but with enough of my nagging, he finally got dressed, kissed me, told me that he would get something to eat on the way back, and left. I immediately tried to keep myself occupied with work I needed to get done for my online business after Logan left, so that I wouldn't dwell on how worried I was, or how drastically our relationship had changed in such a short time. Our lives were so perfect. Until our anniversary date. It was that moment of realization that compelled me to go to the restaurant's website to see if I could find any explanation or evidence that others were going through the same thing as I was going through. To my shock, I discovered that the restaurant was shut down recently due to some kind of parasitic outbreak. It was at this point that I began to panic, and I've tried repeatedly to call his cell phone, but he's not answering. It's as if he keeps allowing it to just go to voicemail. I couldn't just sit and wait for him to return after finding out this information, so I left the apartment in search of him and managed to find his car just up the road. My heart leapt into my throat as I approached it. I looked into the car, expecting to see him in the driver's seat, but nothing. The keys were in the ignition and the car was running. I shakily pulled out my phone to call Logan once more. Then I heard the familiar sound of a phone vibrating, coming from inside the car, as my own phone rang in my ear. I opened the door, followed the sound of the vibration, and found Logan's cell phone on the car floor, lighting up with my nickname on the screen, before the screen went black and the call went to voicemail. As I stood there, some of our neighbors must have seen the look of panic on my face and came up to ask me if everything was all right. I asked if they had seen Logan, and they said that they had seen him walking away about 30 minutes before. I kept searching, but he's just gone. He could be anywhere by now. Logan, baby, if you see this, please come home. The things I'm reading about this outbreak have me scared to death, and I just need to know that you're okay. Update, September 9th, 2023. I've been holding out for the last 2 to 3 days in our apartment. I kept hoping with everything in my heart that I would find him, or that he would come home. But at this point, I just want to know that he's alive somewhere out there. The parasitic outbreak has now claimed most of the city, and since the lockdown, all I can do is sit here, feeling isolated and utterly helpless. I'm writing this because, honestly, I don't know what else to do, and I don't think I can take much more of this. I'm going after Logan at first light tomorrow. For anyone who didn't see my first post, let me quickly recap my situation. April 8th, 2023. Logan and I went on our anniversary date to a restaurant called the Olympic Buffet Feast. After we got home, Logan quickly became sick. Despite suffering for months, it took my persistence and finally putting my foot down for him to head to the emergency department to see a doctor. He left, and that was the last time I saw or heard from him. As it turns out, half the city, and I can only assume Logan, had mysteriously disappeared, only to be discovered in what authorities have identified as an old mining cave just outside the city, called the Devil's Bowels. As of yesterday, the CDC has announced its recovery of a few bodies from the cave that were found to be infected with some kind of mind-controlling parasite. They believe that it was this parasite that has caused the victims to mindlessly walk into the mine, but no one seems to know why. Sadly, this is all the information I've been able to get. None of the bodies recovered to date have been identified, so I have no way of knowing if any of the corpses are Logan. Military special forces are blocking all entry to the mine, but that's not going to stop me. I've made up my mind. I'm going into the Bowels to find Logan, and I'm going to bring him home. Update, September 12th, 2023. The morning after my last post, I grabbed as much gear as my petite frame could carry, drove to a desolate spot as close to the mine as I thought possible without being caught, heaved my gear onto my back, and headed towards the cave on foot. To be honest, I didn't think I would get any closer than about 5 miles from the mine. However, it wasn't as well guarded as I had initially thought. Once I got close enough to see the mine entrance, I could see men in hazmat suits going in and out of the bowels. Under different circumstances and happening to different people in a different part of the world, I would have found this all very fascinating. However, being at ground zero, I felt only waves of fear and a gnawing grief, knowing that Logan had to be in that abyss somewhere. Being momentarily lost in thought, I almost jumped out of my skin as I heard a sudden, blood-curdling scream and watched in horror as a man came hurtling out of the cave and was immediately fired upon by soldiers that were somewhere outside of my line of sight. The man gave off a disgusting, wet scream, whatever infecting him causing his cry to sound as though it was coming from underwater, before he collapsed onto the ground with a sickening splat. I then watched as a squirming mass extended from the mouth of the cave and slowly dragged the corpse of the man back inside the mine. His blood had soaked the ground initially, until the remaining swarm of parasites slurped every bit of blood off the ground as well. Then, though my mind could hardly process the sight, I watched as the parasites gathered and took form into the perfect likeness of the man whom I had just witnessed be shot down and dragged away, and it slowly walked back into the mine. With each step, I could hear the distinct squishing sound, and it took everything in me not to vomit right then and there. In the shock of the moment, as I stumbled backward from where I had been sitting on the crest of a hill, a patrol vehicle drove past and almost caught me, but I ran and was able to hide in a thicket of bushes. They were unfortunately able to confiscate my supply bag from where I had left it, but my determination to find and rescue Logan did not waver. I would just have to do without. I know what you are thinking, but love makes people do stupid things. Very stupid things. As quietly as I could, I started searching for a way into the mine. Fortunately, and unfortunately, it wasn't too difficult to find, as I managed to trip and fall into a hidden vent that had opened up from the mines below, and I fell pretty far, only stopping as my hands found a length of metal, and I was barely able to grab hold. Despite the pain I was feeling from the fall, somehow I managed to lift myself up onto an old rail track that led from one part of the mine to another. I moved quickly, as I didn't know how well this old track would be able to hold my weight, and I managed to find a place on a ledge where I could rest and take stock of my injuries. Surprisingly, I had a few bruises and a few scratches, and a painful swelling in my right arm from when I caught the track, but I was otherwise okay. A few minutes had passed when I started to hear wet footsteps moving in my direction. It took everything in me not to scream, but I knew it would only give away my location if I did. I wanted to make a run for it, but with only the sunlight from the hole I had fallen through, it was hard to see where I was going. The wet footsteps were getting closer now. I had no choice but to try to make a run for the other tunnel, and pray that this one track would hold. As if God himself was watching over me, I had just barely made it into the tunnel on the far end of the track, when I heard the creature screech as the track gave way underneath it, and it plummeted into the darkness below. It had to be a very long drop, because it took a few moments before I heard the splat of the creature hitting the mine floor. I sat against the dirt wall and caught my breath as I began to whimper. I couldn't help but think how stupid this was, and how I had no business being here. Suddenly, I could hear someone call my name. It was weak, but I thought for sure I knew who it was.
Vicky.
It sounded like Logan, but he had to be badly injured because of the way his voice sounded so distant and raspy. "Logan, baby, where are you?" I shouted to him, with no response. In the dark of the tunnel, I couldn't see my hand in front of my face, but I searched around desperately for anything that might help me find my way to Logan. In my fumbling, I ended up accidentally tripping over a box of what felt like flares. I wasn't stupid, though. I grabbed one stick and made my way back to the now broken track, and tried to use the sunlight to determine whether it was indeed a flare and not dynamite.
Vicky, why do you continue to hurt me, Vicky?
The raspy voice said in an angered tone. My heart sank. This thing was not Logan. I felt my last hopes of ever seeing Logan again slip away, as I realized that the creature was simply mimicking him to lure me deeper into the mine. I looked down at the object in my hand again, and what I had initially hoped to be my source of light and guidance, I confirmed to be the explosive that I had feared it would be. In a sudden fit of anger, I lit the fuse anyway as I heard squishy, wet footsteps from the other side of the now collapsed railway tracks. "You took everything from me. Now I'm going to do the same to you." I threw the dynamite, but instead of throwing it at the unseen abomination calling out to me in Logan's voice, I threw it down the mine shaft, hoping to cause as much destruction as possible, even if it killed me. Time seemed to slow down, as my act of defiance triggered an immediate reaction from the creature posing as Logan, and it let out a sickeningly wet, gargling scream before it launched itself across the void towards me, enraged. I watched as the creature came into view for a split second in the light from above, revealing not a human form, but a horrifying, roiling mass of worm-like insects. In its rage, the creature had simply lunged for me, not considering the distance between it and myself, and it again let out that sickening scream as it fell into the depths of the shaft, just as the dynamite exploded in the bowels of the mine underneath. I fell back, crying tears of relief as I tried to get a grip on myself. Within seconds, though, I heard what sounded like a massive, squirming river of parasites quickly closing in on me from every direction. Knowing that there was no other way to go but down, I resigned myself to my fate and curled up in a ball. With no way of escaping, I couldn't help but scream as I thought about how I would never see Logan again. I screamed as I felt all of this was my fault somehow. I screamed as my life flashed before my eyes, and the wave was so close, I didn't need to see them to know that they were right there. I just knew this was the end. Suddenly, I felt strong hands lift me up, and arms wrap tightly around my waist, and I realized that I was being pulled up to the surface.
Hang on!
I heard my savior shout at me as he called out,
Pull now!
Upwards, towards the vent that I had fallen through. I recognized the uniform of the mysterious man immediately as one of the special task force protecting the area. I couldn't help but to sob with relief. My peace was quickly destroyed, however, and I let out a desperate scream as I looked down to see that the worm-like creatures below were rapidly piling up on themselves in order to reach us. Some of them even tried to jump and attach themselves to our shoes. The special agent acted swiftly, dropping a grenade down at the disgusting mass. The last thing I could hear, besides more explosions, was that same loud, gargling scream. I shut my eyes tightly as we finally got to the surface. Despite being in shock from everything I had just gone through, I found myself being handcuffed and dragged into the back of a van, where I was blindfolded and read my rights. I tried asking questions, but they refused to answer anything. About an hour into the drive, I heard a voice that my shattered mind just could not accept. Surely this was just a trauma response, my psyche desperately trying to cling to the familiar.
Sorry for the informalities, but you aren't allowed to see or know where we are going.
I shook my head as I tried to get a grip. The light filtering through my blindfold dimmed, as though the vehicle was entering a darkened area, and it felt like we were going down a hill. "Who are you?" I said weakly, as I felt there was barely any fight left within me.
Special Agent Norman Carter of the Federal Bureau of Unexplained Threats, and according to our files we have on you, you are Victoria Woodland, age 22, 5'8", 128 pounds, and let me guess, you were going after Logan Forsman.
"How do you know so much about me? What did you do with Logan?" I shouted as I could feel the rage building up inside me. He slowly removed the blindfold and then took off his helmet. It was Logan.
Hey, beautiful. Told you not to worry about me.
In the utter confusion of that moment, I wanted to sock him into next week, but instead I broke down crying into his tactical gear. He held me tight as the driver shouted back at us not to do any funny stuff. We both laughed as he undid my handcuffs. He explained to me that his real name was Norman Carter, that he was sorry that he had had to keep all this from me, but that the love he had for me was always real. Final post, September 23rd, 2023. I have been forced to move elsewhere for now, as they have still barely kept the situation at the Devil's Bowels under control. Obviously, there has been a lot more that has transpired that I can't discuss due to the ongoing threat. But as for Logan, or Norman, there's still something that bothers me, something that chews away at the back of my mind as I lay in bed trying to sleep at night. He said that the creatures have the ability to somehow mimic the voices of the ones we love, just like the Wendigo, but they needed the corpse of at least one living person that we were close to in order for that to work. So, my question remains, how did it mimic Logan's voice? And how did it know my name? Hello, dear member of this marvelous community. You have no idea how relieved I am to find you. I need your help. You don't know me, but please hear my story. If you or someone you know can provide any information, I would be most grateful. I'm aware I open myself up as a target to mockery, but it's worth the risk to find one person with a similar experience. If nothing else, I promise, even if you think I'm crazy, I won't bore you. I'm too afraid to tell my friends or family the truth. I know they won't believe me. You, dear friend, are my only hope for peace. This was the worst Christmas of my life. Either Santa Claus is real or my mind has finally broken in a way that feels forebodingly permanent. I can live with either, but I must know which. Even if it is the latter, it would hardly be the worst I've endured. No, the worst is easily when Mr. Monster Maker tried to kill me. That part is certainly real. The whole town knows about it. But let me start at the beginning so you can understand my sincerity. I flew home for the holidays to get away from all the overzealous, hormone-raging assholes at college, not find more. Being away from the dorms for 2 weeks was supposed to be relaxing. Unfortunately, I was only able to enjoy the first 2 days before things slid down shit hill. Our house is in the country. We have an alarm and cameras, but none of it helped. My parents are ER surgeons. I used to appreciate their long hours, but not anymore. Wednesday the 22nd, I drove Mom's car to dinner with high school friends, Sarah and Jen. They were the only other non-woo girls in our class, and therefore the only ones I stayed in touch with. Halfway through the meal, Jen's cousin arrived with a friend and joined us. It didn't thrill me, but it wasn't the end of the world. Her cousin wasn't bad, although Dean was annoying from the moment he sat down. He honed in on me immediately, trying to single me out for conversation and offering to buy my drinks. He looked decent. I might have given him a chance if I had been interested in dating at the time. The more I brushed him off, the harder he tried, as if he couldn't fathom why I was resisting. It's like he set out to systematically raise every red flag on my radar. They decided to hit a few bars after dinner, but I politely declined. I figured I would go home, relax, watch a few Christmas movies, and never see Dean again. That's how life would go for anyone else at least. But no, not me. I wasn't on the road 5 minutes before my phone started going crazy. It sounded like my last tweet was going viral, though I knew that was impossible. I'd be more likely to grow wings. Back home, I saw that Dean had found me on Twitter, then proceeded to like every post and comment on every selfie. They all said various forms of,
"So beautiful,"
or,
"We have so much in common. Let's hang."
He also sent a DM with his contact info and 4 paragraphs of creepy compliments that ended with a list of things he thought we had in common. I've never been so grateful to not have my address or number listed. I don't know why I didn't block him then and there. I didn't think he was dangerous so much as lonely and desperate. Instead, I texted Jen to find out what his deal was. I've included our conversation, beginning with her responses to numerous screenshots. Jen: I was wondering what he was doing. He's been buried in his phone since we got here. Ryan said their mothers are friends. Dean just moved here from his dad's house in Nevada, and Rye is supposed to help him make friends. Me: Weird way to make friends. Think your cousin can get him to ease up? Jen: I'll talk to him, no worries. I turned off notifications to Twitter and started a Christmas story. He already liked everything. I didn't think he could do much more. Both parents were back on the night shift, and I was determined that no one would ruin my blissful solitude. I almost didn't look when I heard Jen's texts 30 minutes later, but I assumed she was saying Dean wouldn't be an issue anymore. I wanted to send a quick thanks, and then forget I owned a phone for a few hours. Here's what was actually said. Jen: Okay, small problem. Maybe just block him and don't read any more messages. Me: You're freaking me out. I have 18 new messages since we talked. Jen: There's something wrong with that guy. Rye distracted him with darts for a few minutes, but he kept asking what kind of guys you like, where you live, and why we thought you weren't responding to him yet. I'm really sorry. I'm buzzed, and he was so annoying. I told him, maybe because you're going full stalker on her after a 20-minute conversation, and he got really upset. Me: The hell is wrong with you? Tell me he doesn't know where I live, Jennifer. Tell me that right now. Jen: Of course he doesn't. We wouldn't do that. But he immediately went back to his phone and started typing with a scary look on his face. Ryan said he had to get home and made Dean go with him. But he genuinely creeped me out. Go block him on everything. You better believe I did just that, but first I took screenshots of the worst messages. I told myself I wanted them for evidence, just in case, but part of me wanted to see how far he went. The answer is way too far. I won't waste your time with the ramblings of a madman. Several contain nothing more than the word fuck used in various creative ways, but I would like to include a few so that you understand that I'm not exaggerating. 10:23 p.m.
Weird. You still aren't home. Do you live outside the city? I know you aren't the kind of person who ignores a good guy like me. Only bitches and ditches do that. Joke. Get it? Anyway, call me when you get home. Drive safe. Lot of crazies out there.
10:33 p.m.
Was that you trying to call? I'm having trouble with my phone. It froze when I tried to answer. Call me back before I gotta come find you. Kidding again.
10:38 p.m.
Why is this bitch calling me a stalker just because I'm trying to be friendly? How does she know I've even messaged you? Pretty shitty you can talk smack about me, but not to me. You want to explain that? You're just like all the others. Everyone thinks you're so much better than me. You have no idea what I'm capable of.
10:50 p.m.
Look, I'm sorry I got upset. That was really unlike me. I've been under a lot of stress with the move. I know we're perfect for each other. I just need you to give me a chance so you can see it too. What's your address? I want to apologize in person. I feel terrible. I know you deserve better, and I'm the best there is. You'll see.
10:57 p.m.
I'm out of patience, bitch. If this is going to work between us, you have to start showing some respect. You've got about 30 seconds to start apologizing.
That was the last one, and I didn't stay to see more. I blocked him with shaking hands before he could finish whatever he was in the process of typing. After sending the screenshots to Jen, I hid my phone under the couch cushion. I didn't want to see it for a while. I tried to focus on TV instead, but my brain had other ideas. It wanted to dwell upon what a small community we lived in. If Dean's mother was in the same social circles as Ryan's, how long would it take him to learn which house belonged to the well-known doctors? How many grateful patients had tracked us down just to deliver casseroles or cookies? Far too many, that's for sure. How did I go from dinner with friends to stalker's obsession so quickly? That garbage is for Halloween, not Christmas. At some point, I fell asleep while contemplating life, the universe, and everything. It's important to keep track of the date, too. Remember, this is Thursday the 23rd now. When I woke, it was daylight, and a note from my parents was on the coffee table. Sleeping till noon, pizza in the fridge. I had food in the microwave before remembering where my phone was and why. There were a few messages from friends, and an apology from Ryan. He saw the screenshots and felt terrible for introducing us to Dean. I know he's a good guy, but I was still too shaken up to pretend I was okay. After answering the texts, my heart sank when I saw Twitter. I had several DMs, which, judging by the new comments, were all from fresh accounts Dean created. Each had a different name and profile picture. How does anyone have that kind of free time? I let my food go cold while changing my settings to private and blocking the new profiles. All the fear I had felt when alone the previous night was reborn into pure fury. There was so much rage bottled inside. I know how stupid it is to engage an unstable person, I really do, but by the time I regained control of my actions, the messages were sent. I unblocked his real account long enough to inform him that I would take my evidence to the police if he made contact again. I should have stopped there, but I went on to say exactly how I felt about him. It's possible I ended it with a list of animals I would rather be with, but it's all so fuzzy now. Only after it was too late did I remember the overwhelming fear of how easily he could find me. I checked the locks on every window and made sure the alarm was on. For the first time, I found myself wishing for a gun. My parents would have a heart attack if they knew. They've, quote, seen more dead family members than burglars, unquote. But that argument holds less weight with me these days. Sorry, I don't mean to get sidetracked, but this has been more difficult to relive than expected. Anyway, I had an almost peaceful day after that. My parents woke at noon, and we talked for a bit before they went to work. Jen wanted to come over, and I was happy for the company. We drank wine, watched movies, and gossiped like we were back in school. By 9 o'clock, we were past tipsy, and I had forgotten about Dean. I didn't even think about him when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I don't answer those anyway. Even when it's not spam, it's never good. If someone has a real emergency, they'll text before giving up. The only reason to call is if you need to pressure someone into something unpleasant. I rejected 3 calls and accidentally opened one text in the process of blocking the number. There was no doubt who sent it.
I know you hit the asshole button, you stupid whore. I'm done being treated like a bitch.
We never did learn how he got my number, but I've had the same one since junior high. It wouldn't have been too hard if he asked the right people. Plus, now that the whole town knows what happened, there's no way anyone would admit to giving it to him. Still, it bothers me. I'm not sure why I've fixated on it. Not like it'll change anything, but I wish I knew. We Googled his name, hoping to learn something that may explain his behavior, but there was nothing aside from the normal social media accounts. Jen told Ryan he should let his mom know about her friend's creepy son. We didn't expect anything to come of it. I think we wanted to feel like we did something other than let him completely get away with it. Imagine our surprise when he responded with not only more apologies, but several news articles. It seemed that Robert Dean Travers, 20, of Shady Pines, Nevada, was the prime suspect in the deaths of 2 women and the disfigurement of another, ages 18 to 22. Mr. Travers was detained by police, but later released due to lack of evidence. There were also links to articles about each woman, including their pictures. It made me nauseous to see how similar we looked. It's true what they say about those guys having a type. There were no other suspects in the case, and no attacks since Dean left the area. Jen told me not to read what he did to them, but I had to know. I needed to know. Assholes on the internet dubbed him the Monster Maker, which led to the press calling him Frankenstein. The survivor told police all she could, but obviously was unable to identify her attacker now that she was blind. Her testimony confirmed what police believed happened, but couldn't prove Dean was the culprit. He found these women in various places, but once he chose a mark, the rest was routine. He put great effort into making social media accounts with fake names and backgrounds to seem more appealing. Police say they were created months in advance and deleted immediately before an attack. Unfortunately, Dean only created and accessed these accounts from public hotspots on disposable phones, meaning it was useless as evidence. No number was ever used to contact more than a single victim. Next, he learned their address, a task at which he became quite proficient. If a date insisted they meet rather than being picked up, he simply waited for them to leave and followed at a distance. Once he knew where they lived, he returned in the dead of night, parking several blocks away from the victim's home. After torturing these women for hours, he poured acid on their faces. Badly beaten as they were, it was still a slow, excruciating death. I read the survival's testimonial where she recounted her moments of laying helpless as the acid ate through her flesh. She describes her blindness as a consolation prize, preferring that to seeing the deformity of her face. It was unquestionably the most horrible thing I have ever read. My chest still aches with the memory of her words. Every night I dream of her. I see her at home, asleep when Dean attacks. I see her terrified face and hear her screams of agony for hours before he uses the acid. He tapes her eyes open, forcing her to meet his gaze as he applies the liquid with a medicine dropper. First to her forehead, but slowly, always slowly, he works his way around her face. The bastard giggles in delight with every fresh tear as he saves her eyes for last. With each drop, a horrible sizzle can be heard as the skin melts away. I think the dreams are part of why I can't move on. If I could just have one night's sleep where I don't see such awful things. I don't know, maybe I'll never recover. Maybe the dreams are my mind's way of telling me I wasn't supposed to survive in the first place. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. I'm sorry about that. I'm just so sleepy. I've been awake for 31 hours, and it's getting harder to concentrate. Where were we? Oh, right, me and Jen on Friday night. We aren't stupid. We knew how serious the situation was after learning about Dean's past. We called my parents, they called the police, and all my hopes were shot to hell less than an hour later when Dad informed me that Dean was cleared of all charges, and his mother explained the horrible misunderstanding that led him to being suspected in the first place. He's actually a, quote, very shy young man, end quote. I stopped listening after that. We tried calling the cops ourselves, but they only repeated the same thing. While they didn't give me quite the brush-off that Dad did, legally their hands were tied. They promised to have a cruiser drive by every few hours, which was more than most people would get. Call it a perk of the relationship between doctors and police. Not that it helped. Jen agreed to stay the night so I wouldn't have to be alone, but aside from jumping at every noise, nothing more happened. She went home the next morning, which is important to remember was Christmas Eve, and my parents continued to reassure me when they woke that afternoon. It was their last shift before having 5 days off. I thought I could survive one more night alone, miles away from the closest neighbor. There had been no contact from Dean since I blocked his number. Horrible as it sounds, I had hoped he found someone else to talk to. Anything that let me think he wasn't trying to find me. I made another round through the house, checking the alarm and locks, but it provided little comfort. How is it possible we live in a world where people know a man like that is free, but they do nothing to stop him? It's madness. They think just because we live in this happy little community where nothing bad happens, nothing bad can happen, and that is dangerously flawed logic. At 9 o'clock, it began snowing, and the forecast warned that it would soon be a blizzard. Even with the porch lights on, I saw little more than a white wall outside. That bastard managed to ruin snow on Christmas. How evil can one man be? I tried to watch TV, but jumping at every sound effect got old fast. Listening to a podcast on low volume was going well, until I heard something hit the kitchen window shortly after 10 o'clock. It was almost the dull thud of a bird, but I had a difficult time believing something tried to fly in that weather, or that it hit such a small target. My feet were lead weights as I forced them to carry me forward, but not to the kitchen. Instead, I went to Dad's office, where the monitors were. My heart skipped more than one beat as my eyes scanned over each screen several times before I could breathe normally again. A large tree stood a few yards away. Technically, it was possible a stick was blown into the window. I saw no signs the snow was disturbed on the ground, but the view was becoming more obstructed by the second. Soon, snow would cover the lenses, and the cameras would be worthless. At that moment, I realized the security alarm was nothing more than an assurance that police would find my corpse first. As much as I prefer that scenario, it was little comfort in the moment. After nearly 20 minutes of staring into the white monitors, I returned to the den. Part of me wanted to crawl under my bed, but the idea of hiding in my room while I imagined Dean lurking down the hall seemed infinitely worse than sitting on the couch and imagining he was in the bushes. No matter what I did to feel safe, my mind found a new way to show me why it wouldn't help. I hate my brain. That bitch is lucky I can't lay hands on her. That's all I'll say about that. It was roughly 10 minutes later when I heard another soft thud, this time from the dining room. I stood before the yellow curtains, trembling, trying to mentally will the curtains aside rather than lift my shaking arms. Somehow, my legs continued to support me, as one hand, slowly, unsteadily, reached forward. Just as my fingers brushed the fabric, a louder thud shook the window. I screamed, falling backwards and landing hard on my ass. I remained frozen, listening to the horrifying crunch of heavy snow as heavy footsteps approached. When they finally came to a stop, I heard something different, something like metal dragging lightly across the glass. That's what erased all doubts of mere paranoia. There was no natural explanation for the deliberate noise I heard. My mind screamed to run, but I only whimpered. It seems I have neither fight nor flight, only freeze. I managed to slide backwards across the floor until I was beneath the dinner table. Making no efforts to lower my voice, I called 911. When finished relaying the address, I noticed the noise had stopped. All was eerily silent. The operator stayed on the phone until they were able to confirm that it was safe to open the door for the police, but there was no further disturbance. One officer took my statement while another checked the perimeter. There were no signs of anyone else, but they admitted it was snowing heavily enough to cover all but the deepest tracks. I think they were trying to be polite because of my parents, but they clearly didn't believe I was in danger. I'm sure they wouldn't appreciate driving in a blizzard either, but what else could I do? I cried again as they left. It felt like they were leaving me to die. It was almost midnight as I watched the cruiser leave our driveway, and with that, my last shred of hope. I desperately wanted to sleep, but any time I felt myself drifting, I remembered the women who were so rudely awakened in the sanctity of their own homes. If my car were there, I would have gone to a hotel. By 1 o'clock, my eyelids were drooping even while standing. I knew if I sat, it would be the end. At one point, I found myself staring at the pile of presents beneath our tree. I thought of all the years I sat in that very spot, shaking gifts, trying to peek inside without tearing the paper, all while ignorant to the fact that I would likely die in the very same room. A loud crash from the kitchen pulled me from the trance. The sound of shattering glass painted a clear picture of someone breaking a pane on the back door to gain entry. When I thought it was impossible to feel more frightened, a series of beeps followed by the silencing of the alarm sent a crippling wave of hopelessness through me. Later, I would learn that Dean worked for a security company in Nevada, where he learned to bypass the alarms. As his heavy footsteps approached, my legs finally decided to function. They felt numb as they carried me to the front door, but I hesitated at the staircase. With the blizzard in full force, outside wasn't an option. Dean was only seconds away from turning the corner, and I was sure my knees would fold the moment I saw him. I ran upstairs. When almost at the top, Dean shouted,
"There she is. Hey, darling, why don't you come on down so we can have a little chat?"
No wonder his last victim couldn't identify his voice. He sounded like a completely different person. It was husky and sinister, almost inhuman. Without risking a glance back, I kept running forward, trying to reach the bathroom. It was the only room with a lock. Not that I thought that would save me, but what else could I do? The maniac was fast. He collided into the door before it would latch. It slammed into my nose, and warm, sticky blood sprayed as I struggled to push against his body weight. He overpowered me effortlessly, pushing the door hard enough to smash my head into the wall behind it. My vision went dark, and in the last moments before losing consciousness, I remember thinking, I hope I don't have to wake up after. When I woke, there were a few seconds where I forgot my circumstances. I couldn't understand why I was in a sitting position, or why my head ached so miserably. The moment my memory returned, panic surged through me, and I opened my eyes to see Dean seated across from me, smiling in a deranged way even Pennywise would find disturbing. I was tightly bound to a dining room chair, with ropes eating into my wrists, ankles, and torso.
"Look who's awake. It's about time, sleepyhead. I was getting so bored I thought I would have to start without you."
Dean smiled, and I did my best not to give him the satisfaction of crying. I was still a little delirious, but a strange calmness possessed me. It happened. I was caught, and soon I would beg for death before being murdered, but there was nothing I could do about it while tied to that chair. I felt dizzy and nauseous, but I was beginning to accept my fate. I decided my only goal was to hurt him as badly as possible in the process. I focused my energy on awaiting my chance, while he launched into a cliché villain rant.
"Did you think you were playing hard to get? Did you think you were being cute? That I would respect you for it? Well, you sadly miscalculated, and now you're going to pay dearly. You could have had everything."
It wasn't manic. In fact, he was the opposite. It was the most composure he displayed yet. He spoke as naturally as if discussing the weather. My brain whispered to play along, to indulge his delusion by apologizing, begging for another chance, but I couldn't. The thought of him having the satisfaction, even for a moment, was unbearable. I summoned every ounce of hate in my soul and tried to express it through my icy glare. But Dean only smiled.
It's a shame, really. Oh well, there will be others. Maybe I'll go to New York next, who knows. But I can't very well stay here. I promised Mother I would behave, and she's going to be livid when she hears about this. It's probably best I leave town before that happens. Don't you worry, though. We can still be together tonight. Your parents won't leave the hospital for hours yet.
Dean rose to his feet, and I tried to control my trembling as he approached. He placed both hands on my shoulders and lowered himself until his mouth was at my ear. I could smell the stench of his rotten breath as he whispered,
Are you ready? I think you...
His words were cut off by a strange sound from the living room. The only way I can think to describe it is as a jingle/scuffle. Dean bolted upright, head snapping in its direction. After a slight hesitation, he reached into the small black bag sitting on the table and pulled out a knife. He winked at me, putting a finger over his lips in a shushing gesture, while mimicking the knife across his throat before tiptoeing around the corner. I didn't believe for an instant anyone was inside. It just wasn't possible. But I screamed, Help! He has a knife! Anyway. Dean was only gone a moment before he returned. The look on his face told me screaming had been a mistake.
Why would you do that? I know you understand what I said, so tell me, what stupid thought ran through that pretty little head that convinced you it was okay to disobey?
He jabbed his finger into my temple with each word, and tears spilled from my eyes. My vision was blurry. When I saw a red glob moving behind Dean, I didn't understand what I was seeing. I thought something in my eye ruptured and was causing me to see red. I didn't know if that was possible, but I was fairly certain we were alone in the house. What else could it have been? I challenge you to find someone above the age of 12 who would think, maybe it's Santa Claus. When in my situation...
You know what? I think it's time to take this party upstairs. But first, I'm going to break one of your legs to make sure you can't run away. I hate to do it, but you clearly can't be trusted.
The madman said in a way that made it obvious he would not hate it one bit. When Dean reached for something behind me, his body went rigid and the popping sounds of a taser filled the room. My mind was unable to process what was happening. I stared at the unconscious form for almost a full minute before noticing the ropes which bound me were on the floor. I lifted my head slowly in search of my rescuer, but found myself speechless as I locked eyes with a man dressed as Santa Claus.
Are you hurt, child?
He asked in a warm, fatherly voice. How? Was all I could say at first.
I know. You're obviously too old to believe in me, but I was flying by when I heard the commotion. I just couldn't keep going, not knowing an innocent young lady was in peril, could I?
He asked, extending his hand to help me up. I took it gratefully. I didn't believe him yet, but he saved my life. If he wanted to hurt me, he would have left me tied to the chair. But, I tried, and failed to speak once again.
It's all right. I imagine you've been through quite the ordeal. Please, follow me into the den while we wait on my assistant.
Placing one hand gently on my back, he guided me to the couch. Once seated, he offered me a mug of cocoa. I don't know where it came from, but I drank it gratefully. Everything else aside, it was, without contest, the greatest hot chocolate I have ever tasted. But before I could learn more, I heard the scuffle jingle sound again. Cocoa sprayed from my mouth when 3 elves emerged from the fireplace.
Excellent. Thank you for coming so quickly. I must resume my flight.
Santa told the elves as he floated up the chimney with no more than a wave goodbye in my direction. The elves looked exactly the same as the ones in the old Rudolph cartoon, clothes and all. I began to hypothesize I was already dead, but I wasn't sure how to test the theory. I watched, mouth agape, as 2 elves entered the dining room, and the 3rd came to stand by me.
Greetings. We're Santa's Naughty Squad. My name is Gibson, and I'm here to prepare the body for police.
He said it quickly, as one does when a phrase is memorized from repeated use. The what? I didn't finish the sentence before Gibson launched into an explanation.
The Naughty Squad is responsible for securing any active crime scene where the big man was forced to intervene. Over the centuries, there have been numerous occasions where the situation has been deemed necessary.
He still spoke, as if reading from a script. At my confused look, the elf let out a long, exasperated sigh, and rubbed the bridge of his nose as if resisting an oncoming headache.
Look, girl, he's Santa Claus. Think about it. Do you really think he would just sit back and let people get butchered if he can help it? The man travels the globe every year. Of course there's going to be times like this. We've seen it all. There's nothing that surprises us anymore.
The professional tone was gone, and it somehow felt stranger to hear him talk like a normal person. It does make a kind of sense that, if Santa is real, he would want to help people when able, if he's real. Just when I thought nothing could shock me more, the other elves returned from the dining room. I turned to see them give Gibson a confirmation nod before they too exited through the chimney.
Great, they're finished. Now here's what you're going to do. Call 911. Tell them you were attacked, but able to incapacitate the assailant with a taser.
He paused to indicate the taser on the coffee table.
The coroner will determine his heart stopped due to pre-existing medical conditions, but they won't look too hard. They'll only be glad he's dead.
Gibson did not wait to answer any questions. The moment he finished speaking, he was gone. I did as I was told, mostly because there was nothing else I could do. Of the information I learned that would have me questioning all I knew to be true, the only item I could focus on in that moment was, elves just murdered a man in my house. I felt like a third party in my own body. As I called 911 to explain the dead serial killer, it seemed like I was watching someone else in a movie. Seeing the sirens fill our yard was surreal. Cop cars, ambulances, and fire trucks lit up our dirt road. I stayed on the couch, giving my story to the lead detective, as dozens of people marched through the house. My parents were the worst part when they made it home. They raised such a fuss. It was almost dawn when the last official vehicle left, and I wanted nothing more than to sleep until noon. We did the best we could to have a happy Christmas, but our hearts weren't in it. I don't tell them about my nightmares. They wouldn't understand. The next day, a profiler with the FBI said the stress of a new environment, especially under the circumstances of Dean's relocation, is what began his spiral. She believes he felt pressured to establish himself in a new community, and, given that he pursued me after I knew his real identity, he had no intentions of harming me at first. It's far more likely he intended to marry me to further his cover as a normal member of society. For a man accustomed to instantly winning his target's affections, my repeated dismissals would have been difficult to tolerate, even on a good day. Coupled with the fact that he was already on edge, guaranteed disaster. Essentially, the more I rejected him, the more he lost his ability to reason. I'm back at college now, but I still can't get this out of my head. It's killing me to stay awake, but the alternative is dreaming of the girl again. I don't want to see her anymore. It's unbearable. I feel as if it will never stop until I learn the truth. Please, has anyone else met the Naughty Squad? Or am I crazy? It felt like a harmless resolution. Everyone makes them, after all. I simply wanted a new me for the new year. Last year had been a joke if there ever was one. With the quarantine having locked us all inside for months, the city nearly shut down completely, but we had all been a little hopeful at the beginning that we could use this time to our advantage. I would use it to better myself. I'd learn a skill, I'd write my book, and never go back to my crappy job again. In that time of uncertainty, we all settled in with high hopes of coming out of this with something better than we'd started. Turns out, I only managed one of those things. I would never have to go back to my crappy job because I was laid off halfway through the year. I had spent the next 6 months wallowing in self-pity, watching Netflix and adding quarantine weight to my belt. My exercise plan went by the wayside. My plans to better myself didn't seem to matter. And as my wife started her new job at the grocery store, her job also having let her go, I settled into depression like a crab into its shell. As I sat on the couch, one show after another rolling past, I saw little reason to do much of anything. When Christmas rolled around, I realized that it had been almost 9 months since I'd done anything of value, and that was when the depression set in. I spent Christmas morning in a funk, sitting in my sweatpants and watching our children open their meager gifts. My wife sat in the armchair opposite me, looking tired but happy with the gifts she'd gotten for them. She'd bought everything, paid for everything, because I was too lazy and unmotivated to do anything. Every now and then, I would catch these little looks from her, little disappointed looks tinged with sadness. All I could do was wallow in my sadness, not sure what I could do now to change it. When New Year's came, I stayed in bed. I didn't feel worthy to join the others for their midnight toast and their energetic countdown. As I heard them count down, I closed my eyes and felt myself make more of a wish than a resolution. 5. I wanted a new me for the new year. 4. A better me. 3. For them. 2. Someone they could be proud of. 1. Someone who wouldn't let them down. Happy New Year. I dozed off to the sound of them ringing in the new year, hoping I would awake to find that I'd found the strength to make my resolution a reality. I woke up to the smell of eggs and bacon, pancakes and syrup, and hearty laughter from downstairs. They had started breakfast without me. The first breakfast of the year was a tradition of ours. Well, why wouldn't they? I hadn't exactly been there for the last few months. Why would now be any different? Why not now? Why not make good on my resolution? I got dressed in something other than sweatpants and came downstairs to the laughter of my family. Someone was sitting at the head of the table, telling a story that had them all in stitches, and I felt a little miffed as I came to the foot of the stairs. Who was this guy? He sounded a little familiar, but I couldn't place him right off. They hadn't woken me up to eat, and now there was some stranger in my house? What the hell was going on here? Lisa, why didn't you tell me we had company? But Lisa said nothing. She had eyes only for the charismatic stranger in my chair. Brad? Janet? Did anyone save me any pancakes? I'm as hungry as a... So glad you woke up to make pancakes this morning, dear, Lisa said, raising her orange juice glass to the man at the head of the table. What can I say? The guy said, and as I moved around to confront him, I took a step back in surprise. I was as hungry as a bear this morning. It was me. I was sitting at the head of the table. I was still the same as I was now, but I looked different somehow. My face was shaved. My hair was cut down from the greasy tangles it was now, and I had dressed in some normal clothes. I was wearing an apron smudged with flour and speckled with grease. More than that, though, I seemed to exude a healthy glow. I was a mess, but I could get better. I was filled with an energy that let people know I was changed. I was full of vigor, full of life, full of pep. I kept yelling at them as they ate, trying to get someone's attention, but they all just kept eating, kept laughing, kept living as though I didn't exist. I made a joke then, my family's laughter the backdrop for the scream that came ripping up my throat as I slowly lost my mind. When he picked up their plates and walked into the kitchen, I followed him. I kept jabbering at the back of his head, the catharsis the only thing that mattered. I asked him what the hell he thought he was doing. I yelled at him to get out of my house, to leave my family alone, and to stop pretending to be me. He stood there, washing dishes, as I screamed at him, and when I was done, he laughed. When are you going to wake up? I am you now, he said, turning around to look at me, my own face smiling back in the face of my confusion. And I have no intention of going anywhere. I took a step away from him. My anger turned to confusion. What are you? I gasped out, backing into the counter as I tried to get away from this strange homunculus. I'm you, your best you, and soon I'll be the only you. I stayed for about a month, just watching them, just to watch him. He was the perfect husband, the perfect father, the perfect man. He went to my son's Little League games. He went to my daughter's band recitals. He remembered my wife's birthday. He remembered her favorite foods, and he made time for her every day. He got out and found a job working at a warehouse, and after a month they talked about making him an assistant manager. He cooked dinners and read bedtime stories, and was the husband and father that my family deserved. And I was there to watch it all, as my family gathered around him, and he became the focal point once again. After a month of living like a ghost in my own home, I left and never looked back. I began to walk one day and just didn't stop for a while. I expected to disappear, to stop existing, but I found that the opposite was true. The farther I walked, the more I began to feel alive again. I hadn't noticed while I had been watching my family live with this strange me, but I hadn't felt the urge to eat or drink in that whole time. The further I moved from my house, the more I realized I was becoming hungrier and thirstier. I had brought my wallet with me out of habit, and the cheeseburger and fries I bought tasted heavenly. I was able to use my debit card and my credit cards for a little while, but after a few months they stopped working, and I was forced to work odd jobs in order to feed and clothe myself. By some stroke of luck, I had purchased some things I would need to survive in my new homeless lifestyle before my credit card was terminated. It wasn't much, but it helped me get far enough away from my old home that people could see me again. It's proximity that seems to trigger it. At least that's what Malcolm thinks. Sorry, I've gotten a little ahead of myself. About 6 months ago, a year into my journey, I met a homeless man at a soup kitchen, and we started talking about our past lives. I told him how I had left my family, making it sound like my wife had left me for another man. But he just smiled and shook his head. He said he had a similar story, his wife leaving him for someone else, but it wasn't just anyone. She left me for another me, just like your wife. I was speechless, but when I asked him how he could know that, he told me a very familiar story. Malcolm had been a company man. He had worked long hours, working holidays and birthdays, and missing most of the moments in his children's lives. One of these special events was a particular vacation where his son drowned while he was at a board meeting. His wife and daughters were distraught. John had been the baby, and they had all doted on him. But Malcolm had only thrown himself harder into his work to hide his grief. One night, New Year's Eve, his wife had come to him and said that she felt like she was in a shell of a marriage, and that she needed a partner more than a bank account. I stood, looking down from my office on the 12th floor, and let my grief wash over me. I wished for a better me, for the man my wife deserved, and I suppose I got it. When I woke up at my desk the next day, I was like Ebenezer Scrooge after the ghosts came to visit him. I rushed home, wanting to apologize for never being there for them, but I was already there. I was sitting at the table. I was talking to them and telling them I was going to turn over a new leaf, and when I saw myself looking through the window, he just smiled at me with the biggest shit-eating grin he could muster. Malcolm, the new Malcolm, had sold his shares of the company, given ownership to the board, and left a rich man. He had taken Malcolm's family away, moving somewhere he could retire and show them the attention they deserved, and Malcolm had never seen them again. He had haunted his empty house for a few months, unsure of where they had gone, but eventually the cops had come and found him squatting there. They could see me again now that my family was gone, and they rousted me from the house. I told them who I was, but they just laughed at me and told me to keep dreaming. I showed them my ID, my credit cards, and they threw me in jail, believing I was a thief. I spent 3 years in prison for petty theft before getting out and hitting the road. That was 20 years ago, and I've been on the move ever since. I travel with Malcolm now, and we have found 2 others since we set out. They seem drawn to us somehow. Our shared grief and sense of strangeness seems to call them. They both have similar stories, similar wishes, and it seems that their wishes also came true. So, give some thought before you wish for a new self in the new year. Your new self may just make your old self obsolete. Jessica Trent waited rather impatiently at the station for her train to arrive. She had never been late to work, not a day in her life, and she didn't plan on starting now. This was going to be a close one, but Jessica was determined to keep her record intact, in spite of nearly everything going wrong this morning. Somehow, Jessica had forgot to charge her phone, leading to her alarm not waking her up. She managed to wake up before it was too late and rushed out of her apartment, almost getting run down by a taxi in her haste. With a few choice words to the taxi driver, Jessica kept her momentum, but that little annoyance cost her some precious time, and she missed the first train across town. Luckily, she had planned for this kind of thing and always took an earlier train than necessary. There would be another train soon enough that could still get her to work with a few minutes to spare. The morning was a particularly cold and foggy one. Jessica hadn't taken the time to notice how dreary it was before, but now she was forced to stop and take in her surroundings. Jessica couldn't control her urge to shiver. The weather must have been affecting everyone that morning. The other passengers waiting at the station seemed a little dazed and somewhat lost. Jessica didn't recognize any of these people. She never really paid any notice to anyone she shared the train with, and this wasn't even her usual train. On a normal day, she would have already boarded the metro and found her usual spot near the door. She would have been seated with her briefcase in her lap, waiting patiently for the train to make its 7th stop where she would exit. On a normal day, she would be warm and carefree. Today, she felt damp and worried that she wouldn't reach her final destination in time. Jessica checked her watch. The next train should have been here by now. That didn't concern her too much. The metro was known to run a few minutes behind from time to time. After a few more minutes, she decided she may have memorized the departure times incorrectly. She tapped her watch to make sure it was still running. It continued to tick away. "Do you know when the train is supposed to be here?" she whispered to the elderly woman next to her. "The train comes exactly on time," the woman replied in a distant and utterly unhelpful way. "Yes," Jessica said, trying to hide the annoyance in her voice. "And when is that exactly?" The woman seemed to stop and think about this question for a second. That was fine. It was not like Jessica was going anywhere anytime soon. Still, it seemed to be taking the woman a while to remember something as simple as a scheduled arrival time. At last, she spoke, and Jessica learned why asking this woman anything was a dumb move. "Sometimes it comes in the morning," she said. "Sometimes it comes at night. Sometimes it comes in between. But whenever it gets here, it's on time." "Thanks," Jessica said, trying to sound sincere and ignoring the urge to ask what kind of Lord of the Rings, a wizard is always on time crap this woman was spewing at her. The wait was agonizing. Jessica checked her watch over and over again before she realized that now it had stopped. The fog was so dense that she couldn't see any hint of sun peeking through. There was absolutely no way for her to know how long she had been standing there. Her fellow travelers all seemed preoccupied with their own worlds, and no one was talking to anyone else. Jessica felt like she had been at the station for hours, but that was impossible. Another train should have shown up after just a few minutes. If something had gone wrong with the train, or the track, or anything else, someone would have come to tell the people waiting. No, it must have only just been a few minutes. Jessica was just impatient. Impatience only makes things feel longer. After waiting longer and considering giving up taking her chances with walking to work, Jessica finally decided to take the time to observe the people she would be riding with. The assortment of people was certainly diverse, to say the least. The woman who had the vague answer about the train's arrival time was a kind-looking, elderly black woman who wore a heavy coat, bundled up tightly enough for the weather. On her other side, Jessica saw a man in a business suit, your standard office worker. He didn't seem to be in much of a hurry. Maybe he took this train more often and he was used to it by now. Most of the other passengers were exactly what you would expect. There were a lot of people who appeared to be homeless, and just looking to get out of the cold for a while. Others had probably been retired for a very long time and could hardly walk, let alone drive. There were a few teenagers who looked like they would likely cause trouble if this weather didn't have them so lethargic. Jessica also saw what she assumed to be a father kneeling down to speak to his son in sign language. She assumed no one at the station had been speaking because she hadn't heard anyone, but these two were really holding a conversation. From what she could decipher of their facial expressions and body language, it seemed the boy was scared of something, and his dad was trying to comfort him. Maybe it was his first time to ride on the train. Jessica was a little scared the first time she took the metro as a girl. The wait didn't get any easier. Jessica was chilled to the bone. Had it gotten colder? Was that even possible? Not being able to check the time on her watch or her dead cell phone was making her crazy. She needed to know how much longer the train would be, or at least how long she'd been waiting. "Can anyone tell me what time it is?" she finally blurted out when she couldn't stand the silence anymore. As she looked around for a response, all she found were smirks. What did these people know? Was this some kind of prank? "You're just like my son," said the elderly woman from before, with a hint of nostalgia in her voice. "He was always in a hurry too. Don't worry, child. The train will get here when it gets here. You won't be late to where you're going." "I'm sure you're right, ma'am," Jessica said. She was losing what little patience she had left. "But that's not what I asked. Can you tell me the time?" "The time don't matter if you—" "Yeah, that's okay." Jessica cut her off. She hated to be rude, but she couldn't stand listening to this woman avoid her questions anymore. Why wouldn't anyone answer her? Was she on some sort of hidden camera show? She better not be. She didn't have time to sign release forms and shake the host's hand. She had places to be. The waiting got worse and worse. Even more people showed up to the station and the fog got denser. Jessica considered calling a cab before she remembered that her phone was a brick at the moment. She considered asking to borrow someone else's, but quickly discovered her wallet was missing. Maybe she left it at home, or maybe she'd lost it earlier that day. Hell, maybe one of these punk teenagers had taken it. It didn't really matter that much. She never kept much cash on her, and she could cancel all of her credit cards. She was sure that if she went to look for it, the train would arrive in her absence. That assumption turned out to be correct. After what felt like a week of waiting, Jessica saw the train approaching down the track. The familiar sounds put her mind at ease. It looked a little different in the fog, but she couldn't mistake her most trusted form of transportation coming to save her from the torture of waiting with these people. As soon as it stopped in front of them, she was ready to board and be off to work. She was just about to step closer when she heard a pre-recorded voice come over the loudspeaker. "For a speedier departure time, please have your tickets ready when you board the train. Thank you." Tickets? The metro was a free shuttle service. Jessica never needed a ticket before. What was she going to do? She was going to be late for sure. "For a speedier departure time, please have your tickets ready when you board the train. Thank you," repeated the message. "Settle down, child," the friendly but unhelpful older woman said, apparently sensing what Jessica was worried about. "Your ticket is in your pocket. Just look." Jessica checked her jacket pocket. Sure enough, she found her ticket. How did that get in there? Jessica never bought a ticket for the metro. Why would she? The metro was free. "You shouldn't have left so fast earlier, dear." The woman continued to talk as though she could read Jessica's mind. "They would have explained all of this to you." Explained what? For the first time all morning, Jessica was concerned about something other than getting to work on time. The other passengers were filing into the train around her. "I'm old, there's no denying that," the woman continued with a small cough. "A lot of us here are. That's why we need to take the train. Some of us just got nowhere else to go." A homeless man shuffled between the two of them. "It breaks my heart to see that poor man and his son here, though. The kid already had it hard enough, but not being able to hear a truck coming. Shame. Good thing his dad is there for him." What are you talking about?" Jessica said. She was getting tired of the woman's roundabout answers. "Just tell me what the hell is going on." That did it. Any chance Jessica had of not coming off as rude was gone now. The elderly woman looked at Jessica just like a mother fed up with being patient with her children, one that was ready to give her child a dose of reality. "If you would have just waited a minute after that taxi hit you, you wouldn't be so confused," she said in a blunt tone. "Someone always comes to explain things and show you your ticket." The woman took a deep breath. "You're dead, child. There's no way around it. We all are, all for different reasons, all in different times in our lives, but we're all just as dead. It's time to move on to wherever the hell we're going to next. Now get your ticket ready. We're holding up the train." Somehow, Jessica had nothing more to ask. She was speechless. Perhaps she was in shock. She remembered the taxi hitting her. She remembered lying there on the pavement. She remembered the pool of blood gathering around her head. She remembered seeing her wallet fly away from her as she felt the impact. She remembered the panicked screams of the young woman who witnessed the whole thing. She remembered standing back up and cursing the driver before leaving the scene. She remembered stepping over something, too hurried to recognize it as her own body. Silently, Jessica did as she was told. As she boarded the train for the last time, her mind ruminated on how she was always so focused on getting to her next destination, she even rushed into her final one. Though she had always been on time, she would now always be the late Jessica Trent. Don't Fuck with Tessa by Nightmare's Edge. Tessa had always been a shy girl. During high school, she was often made fun of because of her short stature. It was something that always bothered her, but she always tried to remind herself that she was the bigger person. Rarely did it have a lasting effect on her own outlook. Kids in school could be terrible, wretched things, and it often went unchecked by those who should be correcting this behavior, but rarely did. Tessa's shyness often led her to just accept the cruelty of those who were the usual perpetrators of these terrible acts against her, and she was not the type to tell on others. "It's not what the cool kids do," she later recalled her friends telling her. What Tessa didn't seem to realize, however, was that deep down there had been a darkness growing, one that would someday lead her down a path she could not return from. 2 weeks before graduation, a late prom was being held due to the virus that had taken the world by storm. Tessa had been asked by Stephen to the prom, and she had gladly accepted. Stephen wasn't popular or all that particularly good-looking, but he was funny and very, very smart, and one of the few people who were not constantly harassing her. She had spent the day with her mom, getting ready for the biggest night of her life. She had cut her hair short into one of those cute little styles that all the girls were raving about. She had spent a small fortune on a dress, and her mother did her makeup. To everyone except those who were cruel to her, she was absolutely stunning. When Stephen arrived at the door, he was utterly speechless at the sight of her. He knew that he was going to be the luckiest boy at the prom. He could hardly contain himself, and with great force of will, he forced himself to speak. "Hi, Tessa," his voice cracked. Tessa's mom was a short distance behind them at the door, and several tears escaped her eyes. Her daughter was going to prom, and she was absolutely beautiful. This Stephen boy seemed like a stand-up fellow, so she had no fear of her daughter going with him. She finally heard Stephen from the door. "Good evening, Miss Daughtry." "Hello, Stephen. No funny business. You know who I am." "Yes, ma'am," he replied, and he was certain he might have pissed himself if she had stepped forward. He extended his arm, and Tessa tucked hers around his as they left, her mom closing the door behind them. Stephen didn't have a car, so they planned to walk the few short blocks to the pavilion where the prom was being held. During their walk, some of those vile girls from the school drove by, yelling obscenities and hurtful words at them, but they didn't even seem to notice. Tessa and Stephen enjoyed their walk. He was captivated not only by how beautiful she was, but by her nerdy, geeky banter. Tessa, however, was actually looking at Stephen in another light tonight. He was deceptively muscular beneath those ill-fitting clothes. They finally arrived at the school and were about to enter, when those nasty girls stepped out the front doors and stood in front of them. "Who the hell do you think you are? You put on a dress and you think you're Rachel Lee Cook?" She laughed, an ugly laugh. "Just let us pass," Tessa said, her confidence surprising even herself. One of the girls stepped forward, and Stephen stepped between them. He wasn't intending to fight, but he wasn't going to allow them to hurt Tessa while he stood by. Without warning, one of the boys who was with the girls punched Stephen in the face. Tessa watched as it seemed to happen in slow motion. Then, a second boy started to kick Stephen as he leaned back slightly. Tessa stood frozen in fear. She had no idea what to do. Stephen was now on the ground, and the boys were continuing to beat on him, with no regard for how badly they were hurting him. "Tessa, run!" Stephen said between blows. Tessa was terror-stricken, but she listened to him. She would run home and get her mother, who was the chief of police in their small town. She heard the blows continue to rain down on Stephen, and then suddenly they stopped. She almost didn't hear it. "Dude, I think he's dead." There had been some excitement in that voice, but also alarm. She slowly turned around to see the last of the group close the door behind them as Stephen laid there, beaten and battered. Tessa dropped her small purse and corsage and started running back to where Stephen was laying, her shoes coming off as she ran. Tears were flowing down her face, her mascara running. Something inside of her started to speak, but she could not hear it, as in the moment she was only concerned for Stephen. She finally got to where he was laying and knelt down hard next to him, not realizing she had scraped her knees on the cement floor. She rolled him over onto his back and looked at his face, looking for some sign that he was still alive, but there was none. She put her ear next to his mouth and nose and listened for a breath, but none had come. Then she placed her fingers on his neck, wishing with every fiber that she would feel a pulse, but again there was none. Her tears stopped flowing. She felt nothing but pure, burning rage within her being. She stood up, not feeling the blood that ran down her legs from the wounds on her knees. She turned away from Stephen and walked back to where she had dropped her purse. She picked it up and slipped her hand inside. She found the handle immediately. The knife had been a gift to her from her father, who had died in the line of duty 5 years ago. He said that she should always keep it near her, as you never know when it might come in handy. What Tessa had planned now certainly was not what he had in mind. She turned back to the pavilion and slowly started stalking back. She was no longer the slight, timid girl. In fact, she would become the story that teachers would tell to their students in hopes to keep them from bullying each other. She heard the loud thumping music coming from the dance floor and headed in that direction. She pushed the door open and slipped inside. There, she looked for those who had just taken her Stephen from her. It did not take long, as they were in the middle of the dance floor, acting as if nothing had happened. And I suppose, to them, it was nothing. Stephen was nothing but some loser who probably would have thanked them for killing him because his life was so worthless. No one was paying her any attention, and somewhere deep in her mind, she knew this was a good thing, but in reality, she had already planned on doing what needed to be done, regardless. She walked onto the dance floor and towards the bitch who had stopped on the way in. Still, no one saw her. She walked up slowly behind the girl, and without hesitation, shoved the small blade in the girl's neck, perforating the vital artery that lies there. She quickly pulled the blade out and stepped back into the crowd. At first, there was no reaction from anyone around. The low, flashing lights and the sound of the speakers booming with music covered the sounds of any scream that might have escaped the bitch's mouth. Tessa watched as the girl started to wobble, and another of her friends started to walk towards her to catch her if she fell. The boys were still dancing and had no clue what was happening. As the other girl reached her friend, Tessa was almost instantly by her side, again burying the small knife to the handle in her neck. The blood had now begun to pool underneath them, and one of the girls slipped in her struggle to flee. And since no one had realized yet what was taking place, Tessa bent over and sliced through her Achilles tendon. Both girls tried to scream, but Tessa pushed them forward and moved back into the crowd again. The boys, still dancing, finally turned around to see both girls on the floor and tried to rush to their sides, only to slip and fall in the pooled blood. One of the boys landed hard on his face, knocking himself out, while the other still attempted to crawl over to the girls. Tessa pounced again, landing hard on his back. Tessa noticed that someone outside of the group had finally realized what was going on, and she somehow managed to pull herself from the frenzy, making her way to the boy who had knocked himself out. The same boy who had thrown the first punch earlier. She didn't care that he was defenseless. She grabbed a handful of his hair, yanked his head back hard, and he awoke, only to feel a blade being dragged across his throat. With one more final thrust of the blade, she stabbed it into his neck. She left the knife this time, but the blood was already pooling. She looked out at the crowd, who now had begun to back away from the chaos, and she saw the teachers running in their direction. She was up and moving as fast as she could. She was short and small, yes, but she was quick. She bolted for the doors, knocked them open, and continued her sprint, although she had no idea where to go. After leaving the building, it was like a candle inside of her had been snuffed out, and that rage and anger she had felt was now slowly fading away. She gagged in disgust at what she had just done. I have to get home, she thought, turning towards her house and sprinting into the night. She stood there at her door for a moment before knocking, as she had left her keys in her purse, which still laid where she had dropped it back at the pavilion. Chief Daughtry opened the door, only to find that no one was there. She stormed out onto the porch, shouting half-jokingly but with authority into the night, "Do you know who I am?" She looked around but didn't see or hear anyone. Sadly, she would later realize that the moment she had sent her beautiful daughter off to what should have been the most exciting night of her young life was the last time she would ever see her daughter again. There had been rumors that she had been the cause of the tragedy at the prom that year, but because of the chaos, the darkness, and the blaring noise of the music, no one could ever be certain. Pomegranate Lipstick by Reddit user BeeIsBack. We really shouldn't be doing this, she spoke between kisses. We're both ladies and... Hush, Emily, the other woman breathed, and Emily melted into the moment. They'd met less than an hour prior, when the party, a glamorous annual ball hosted by some rich family, was just beginning. Emily was tired of the spectacle the second she stepped out of her automobile. After 15 minutes of swirling golden champagne around in a crystal flute and avoiding conversation, her gaze was drawn to a woman across the floor. Her dress was emerald, a velvet number that hugged her like she was a film actress. Her hair fell in flaming auburn waves down her exposed back. Her lips were painted in a rich pomegranate lipstick. Striking hazel eyes met Emily's, and a heat arose in Emily. The woman smiled, a teasing invitation, and Emily was enchanted. Before they knew it, they were pressed flush together in a darkened hallway, away from the party and away from prying eyes. What is this? Emily whispered to the other, touching the smeared lipstick on her own lips. Does it matter? Was the response. She started, before both of their attention was snapped away by the sudden crack of shattered glasses and piercing shrieks from the ballroom. The moment ended, and both women started back towards the ballroom, where the screams continued. What Emily saw sickened her beyond measure. Dozens of guests were dead on the floor, pools of blood spattered across the marble floor, and the guests that weren't dead or hysterical were biting into other guests, latched on like ticks, or lapping up the spilt blood like dogs. Without thinking, Emily turned, grabbed her companion by the wrist, and bolted, both of their heels clicking against the floor as they ran. What was that? Emily sobbed once they were tucked away in a bedroom far from the chaos. What were those people doing? We need to run. She reached for the woman's hand, but the click of footfalls outside the door halted her. Quick, she whispered, into the wardrobe. They squeezed into the closet, and no later than a second after they closed the door, the bedroom door creaked open. Please, God, don't let this be the end. But, as if her own heartbeats were alarms, the wardrobe was abruptly opened, and it sent both women tumbling to the floor. The first thing she noticed about the man was his bloodied shirt, but the most striking feature were his shining white fangs. He stopped. "Ah, I see," he said. "This one is yours, Lucille. I'll leave you to it." "What?" Emily thought as the man left, turning to face her companion. She'd risen, and panic flooded Emily as her eyes locked onto a matching pair of gleaming fangs, stark white against the faded pomegranate of her lips. "Sorry, Emily. I did love your company, but you can't leave alive." And death was bitter, but sweet too, like pomegranate. Dream Girl by Dr. Plague. She's walking through the halls of my high school. Her hair is a halo of gold. She runs through my dreams as I slumber, my sanity threatening to fold. I rubbed the bridge of my nose and took another sip of coffee. It was strong and black and warm from sitting untouched for so long. I looked back at what I had written, 12 verses written over a 5-year period, and each more troubling than the last. This poem would likely be my unfinished work, a labor of love that would remain my last big mystery. But the subject of the poem is herself a mystery to me. Lisa, the darling girl of my dreams, who every night steals a little more of my soul, has been with me for 5 long years. Lisa, the girl who no longer exists. I stroll through the halls of academia. I move through a silence that creeps. She glides like a goddess of reason, this angel who comes when I sleep. I wrote those words on January 25th, 2014. I was a sophomore in high school, still struggling to mold my burgeoning talent, while dealing with the growing flames of my teenage horniness. I'd been told for years that I wrote well, English teachers and creative writing teachers praising my work, but they always said that my work lacked a focus that they hoped I would find in time. Your ideas are scattered, your thoughts uncoordinated, and for someone with your raw talent, these are threads that we hope you will find. This is what my 9th grade English teacher wrote on my final assignment, a short story about the idea of servitude, but not slavery, right under the lurid red A she'd written on the paper. Miss Harper had told me often that I had talent, but also told me that she expected me to focus that talent if I ever thought to make something of myself in the written trade. On that day, as I sat at the picnic tables outside the cafeteria and wrote ideas in my notebook, I found some of the threads she was talking about. I had slept deeply the night before and dreamed vividly, as I did sometimes. In the dream, I was walking through the halls of Chester C. Smith High School, and on that day I walked alone. There was none of the usual tropey, at school in your underpants sort of thing, but the school did have a slightly lucid feel to it. I felt like I was underwater, everything having a slightly wavy feel to it. As I walked, I began to become more and more sure that something was watching me. There was no one there. The silence in the school was almost oppressive. But at the edge of my vision, I could just make out the form of a girl following me. She slid silently along the walls, glided noiselessly through the world, and several times as I whipped around suddenly, I could just see her hiding from me. Those few glimpses were enough to tell me 2 things. She was human, and she was lovely. She stalks through my dreams like a shadow, a hunting cat ready to pounce. Her mind is a mystery to me, her very secrecy, her humanity renounced. I had the dream again a week later. It was much the same, walking through the silent halls of high school, the terrain wavering like aquarium weeds. as this ghostly girl stalked me. I did not indicate that I was aware of her, not turning or speaking, but just studying her out of the corner of my eye. She was blonde, corn silk hair spilling down her back in a sheet, and her clothes were a pair of jeans and a simple shirt of no particular design. She seemed to be my age, but could have been older. There was a way about her that made me think she was older than I in her mind, like when you meet someone who's had to grow up very quickly and been forced to cast their childhood aside before they were comfortable. She followed me silently until I woke up, and when I sat up, I grabbed for my notepad on the nightstand and wrote these 4 lines. I wouldn't visit her again for 3 months. Her secrecy seems to be prudent, for her shelter is not solely her own. I have seen that which lurks in the shadows, and it threatens to evict her from home. Writing about the Dream Girl was what I had named it after the second verse, had lit a fire in me, it seemed. Suddenly, I was writing pieces for every school contest, submitting poems for every poetry club event, and gaining a small amount of celebrity amongst the students that flowed in these circles. My teachers had always praised my work, but as my peers began to notice my talent, I started to see this as more than a hobby. I began to believe that I might be able to make it outside the community of my high school. When the spring poetry contest was announced, a contest held for students nationwide, I threw myself into it, heart and soul. I stayed up for 3 days crafting the perfect poem, the greatest work of my life, and when I hit send on it, I slumped back into my chair and let the euphoria wash over me. It was Saturday night. I was exhausted after the effort of birthing my perfect work into the world, and all I wanted to do was sleep. I crawled into bed and fell into a deep and untroubled sleep for the next 12 hours. I learned more about her world in those 12 hours than I wanted to. I walked through the doors of my high school and saw the ethereal backdrop for my dream again. It was almost comfortable here. The quiet serenity of the place was a change from the steady flow of ideas and couplets that had been running through my head lately. But I was almost immediately aware of something missing. I looked behind me, expecting to see her dodge away or hide from me, but she wasn't there. This was the only time I could remember being truly alone in this place, and it was a little strange. To feel so alien in a place that you occupy every day is a strange feeling indeed, but I felt my steps taking me into the school once more, so I let myself be led wherever the dream was taking me. As I walked, I was aware of a noise. The fact that there was a noise at all was strange, but the type of noise was stranger still. It was a vibration, a rhythmic thumping from under my feet, and it disturbed the unusual stillness of this place. Thump, thump, thump. Then silence. A few minutes or hours or days later, there would be another thump, 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 followed by a return to the same silence. As I explored the high school, I found myself drawn to the boiler room over by my civics class, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the thumping was probably coming from there. The boiler room was a large subterranean basement used by the custodians to store excess chemicals and broken machinery they were hoping to fix someday. It was also where students of a less scholarly caste went to make out or smoke between classes, since it lacked a fire alarm. When I got close to the boiler room, I heard the thumping more clearly and realized I'd been right. There was definitely something in the boiler room, something big, and I doubted it was a group of teenagers necking a little too enthusiastically. When I wrapped my hands around the door handles, though, I was immediately pushed backwards into the lockers against the far wall as something came barreling up through the doors. She turned to glare at me, teeth bared in feral challenge, but when she saw who I was, she stopped growling and started scrambling down the hall towards the English classroom. I sat against the lockers, my backside aching where it had connected with the lockers, and listened to something big and angry make its way up the stairs. I didn't want to know what was making that noise, but I was powerless to do anything but sit there against the lockers. I'm not one to freeze up in dreams. A familiarity with lucid dreaming had probably led me to become way too comfortable in these dreams. But as whatever it was lumbered angrily up from the depths, I realized a fear I hadn't known since childhood. The slap on my shoulder brought me out of these fears as the blonde girl thrust her hand at me and spoke the first words of our strange relationship. "If you don't want to die, then you'd better start running." She offered me a hand, and a moment later we were flying down the polished halls. As we rounded the corner, I heard something burst through the doors, and it sounded like an angry piece of construction equipment as it followed us. My guide took us down hallway after hallway, taking corners at random, before finally wrenching open the door to a custodial closet and pushing both of us inside. She cracked the door, peeking out into the hallway, and all I could do was lean against the wall and pant. I was tired. I didn't ever recall being tired in a dream before. And as I sat, I realized my butt still hurt where I'd hit it on the locker. I wanted to ask things, what was chasing us, and why for starters. But as the thumping footsteps got closer to our hidden cubby, I was filled once more with that sense of dread. I moved up beside her, peeking out into the hallway, as a creature like nothing I'd ever seen before dragged itself into view. It was shadow, it was darkness, and as its form slithered past us, it looked to be amorphous as well as boundless. She closed the door quietly before it came even with it, and sat back in the closet as the creature moved off into a different part of the school. We sat in silence for nearly 10 minutes before I dared to speak. What the hell was that? She looked at me quizzically, and I feared she was incapable of hearing me. I would later come to realize how long it had been since she'd had anyone to talk to. She closed her eyes as I repeated my question and seemed to savor the sound they made. She relished them, burned them into her memory, rolled around in them like a dog with a smell it likes, and when she'd finally absorbed them as much as possible, she answered me. "I don't know. I've been calling it shade for however long it is that I've been here." Her voice was thick from disuse, but it was cultured with just a hint of an accent that I couldn't place. She told me her name was Lisa. She told me she believed she was 16, but couldn't be sure. She told me she had been here for as long as she could remember. She told me that she could move between dreams. "Between dreams? What do you mean?" Instead of telling, she showed me. Her hand looked like a starfish when she set it against the back wall of the janitor's closet. The pinkness of her skin stood out against the dingy wall and made it all the more apparent when the paint began to crumble and the wall began to melt away. Suddenly, there was sunlight in the closet, thick and buttery against the dingy darkness, and we were looking at a field of flowers that stretched on into infinity. I put my hand against the image, expecting resistance, but instead fell into a landscape of fragrant technicolor flowers. Lisa came in behind me, and as she did, the portal back to the high school closed. "Where are we?" She shrugged. "Some other dream?" "She has it pretty often. As long as we stay out of the area where she is, then she'll never know that we were here." I had a million questions to ask her, too many to organize right away, but just as I'd found my voice again, someone was shaking me and my mom was asking if I was hungry and might like some dinner. It was 2 weeks of hoping and praying before the dream returned. I sit at the edge of the precipice, looking at the world from afar. I'm a prisoner of my reality. My passage to her world has been barred. I spent those 2 weeks in a haze. I received word that my poem had gone to nationals, and I think that my distracted nature was seen as dazed relief. They thought I was happy, that I was living in the clouds, but in my mind, I just wanted to go back to the dream. She needed me, and I needed to know more about her. I spent those 2 weeks analyzing what I now knew about the dream. The first was that whatever happened in the dream happened in real life. I had woken up the next morning with a large bruise on my backside and a similar bruise on my shoulder. Either I had hurt myself outside the dream and it had translated into the dream itself, something I doubted, or I could be hurt inside the dream. The second thing was far more urgent. I needed to find out how to instigate the dream. I tried recreating the events that had led to the dream, dragging myself to the edge of collapse or overworking my mind without rest until I dropped. But it was no use. 2 weeks later, and I hadn't had so much as a dream that I could remember in the little amount of sleep that I'd gotten. As I went to sleep that night, I focused all my mental faculties on the dream itself, how it had felt and the landscape I'd been in, and as I focused, I could feel my mind slipping off to sleep. I awoke in the high school again. I ran through the halls, heedless of what else might find me, and it wasn't long before she had tracked me down again. She dropped into the hallway before me, seemingly from nowhere, and when she saw me, her face split into a wide grin. She ran to me, wrapping me in her arms. She smelled ethereal as I wrapped my arms around her as well, of old dust, of sour memories, of the universe itself. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," she said, and in her voice, I heard relief. Her world lies alongside my own, my dreams the key to her realm. But how did she come to reside here? Her own dreams have been overwhelmed. She took me back to the field of flowers. There, she answered my questions. I asked her a million questions as we sat together in the field. We had found a tree that sprang from the flowers in clear confusion, and we sat there as she told me her story. Until that moment, I had believed she was older than I, maybe by as much as 5 years. But as she spoke, her girlhood came back to her. She drew her knees in close, her blonde hair creating a curtain through which she peeked at me, and she seemed embarrassed by the story. No, not embarrassed, I now realize. She was afraid that telling it to me would make it true. She'd had her own dream once. She couldn't remember what had happened before it, but she could remember there being a before. She had dreamed inside a castle and played princess with knights and wizards at her command, and dragons and goblins to slay. Sometimes she had stood on the battlements and looked pretty as the knights fought for her favor. Sometimes she had put on armor and killed the dragons herself, leading her knights on grand adventures. Whatever she was doing, she was happy, and the dream had returned almost every night. It returned because I wanted it to. It came back because I thought about it before bed, and so my mind opened the portal to this place. These dreams aren't normal dreams. You can get hurt in them, and you can even die in them. When you dream here, your mind takes you to a place in the spirit world. I don't know how, so don't ask, but I know that it is so. She had dreamed this dream for quite some time, years, she said. when one day something different happened. Her knights had encountered something on the edges of her kingdom that had killed some of them. None of my knights had ever died in my dream. They would get hurt sometimes, but a wizard would always heal them. When they didn't come back, and the wizard couldn't make them come back, I knew this was different. I knew this was something else. For 2 nights, it had destroyed her dream world. When it came to the castle, I was too afraid to fight it. It was dark and scary, and it looked wrong. I hid it inside the castle, unable to face it, and as it broke down my walls, I closed my eyes and tried to wake up. I tried and tried, but it wouldn't happen. And when it finally got me, I woke up somewhere else. That was when she discovered that she could make portals between dreams. She'd thrown her splayed hand against the castle wall as the bulbous thing had loomed over her, and suddenly a circle had appeared on the wall. It showed a desert in the throes of a sandstorm, and she'd jumped in without a second thought. She'd woken up in someone else's dream. She floats like a dandelion dreamer, adrift on the seas of a dream, never to return to her own mind, her world never to be as it seems. I visited with her often over the next few years. The dreams came almost every night, and as we explored, we grew closer. She told me that no matter how much she tried, she couldn't wake up. She could sleep, still needed to sleep, but as for eating or drinking, she found that she didn't need these things anymore. The bulbous creature followed her no matter where she went, but she was able to avoid it, and over time, she just became used to living inside other people's dreams. She didn't know how long she'd done it, and she didn't care. I was not the first person to try to talk to her, but I was the only one who believed she was more than a figment of their imagination. This dream girl has stolen my senses. Her beauty has taken my mind. I know that life is ephemeral, but I know that her heart must be mine. I didn't acknowledge right away that I was falling for her, but I think I knew deep down. My poems became all about her, this ephemeral goddess that walked my dreams, and my fans responded. I had members of the art club asking to paint her from my description. I had droves of female fans asking me to tell who she was. They believed she was someone at the school that I was sharing my nights with. I had people who had read my work asking about her, my moonlight girlfriend, but I gave out very little information. For her part, I could tell she appreciated my company, but she seemed afraid to get close to me. As months became years, she showed me sights that defied description. She took me to dreamscapes so beautiful that I could hardly grasp them, and to places so wondrous I can hardly describe them, but all the while, she refused to tell me what she was looking for. Her hand would creep into mine on occasion, though, and I remembered being filled with warmth each time she touched me. Inevitably, our night excursions would be cut short by the appearance of the shadow creature. He would blunder upon us, his screamy sucking sound glopping before him, and we would flee until he moved away. She never fought him, said it would be useless to try, but I somehow knew that as long as it existed, she would never really be safe. As time passed, I noticed her become more melancholy, and one night I asked what was troubling her. She took my hand, interlocking our fingers, and looked at me across what seemed like 1,000 miles. I don't want this to be my life anymore. I want to hold your hand, feel its texture, and know that when the dawn comes, I won't be left alone. I want to leave this place, I'm sick of looking over my shoulder for the shadow creature. I want a life." She sounded so sad, so adrift, but I had no idea how to help her. "She longs to leave here forever, this kingdom ethereum so deep. She wishes to walk in the moonlight, to walk her own dreams as she sleeps." I was in my senior year when she left me forever. I came into the dream high school that I'd come to know so well and found her sitting in an empty classroom. She was seated in one of the desks, and at first I thought she was asleep. When she turned to look at me, though, I could see that she was deep in contemplation. She looked up at me with real hope, and I realized that something had happened while I was gone. "I think I need to destroy the shadow creature." She detailed her plan, how if she killed it, she might be allowed to go back to her dream and wake up. But all I could hear was the first lines of her suicide note. I tried to reason with her, talk her out of this needless waste of her life, but she wouldn't hear of it. I had clearly underestimated her resolve, and every argument against it only seemed to infuriate her more. "I thought you were different. I thought you understood how important this was to me. Well, to hell with you then. I'm going with or without you." She walked out and I let her go, unable to say any more. When I woke up, I fought sleep for the next 4 days. I was out of high school by then, starting my second year of college, and my poems had appeared in magazines and compilations since my senior year. I had woken up in my familiar bedroom and immediately went to find a cup of coffee. For the next 4 days I drank coffee. I took caffeine pills. My face stung from slapping it, and I fought the urge to sleep. I didn't want to go back to that place and see what had happened to her. The thought that she was dead scared me, but the thought of what she'd become if she killed Shade scared me even more. Eventually, I lost the battle and was forced to submit to sleep. When I returned to the halls, it was like the first time. I felt no one, and the silence was oppressive. In ethereal halls I wander. The only sounds are my own. I listen for her, but hear nothing. I find myself all alone. I searched for her for hours. I combed the school, every classroom and mop closet, from the library to the gym, but she was nowhere to be found. I quickly found myself running through the halls, calling her name, as I threw caution to the wind and wanted nothing but the solace of her voice and her presence. I wanted to see her, to know she was okay, and to apologize for my cowardice. A cowardice I was still indulging even then. I would not let myself think about the cellar. She's walking through the halls of my high school. Her hair is a halo of gold. She runs through my dreams as I slumber, my sanity threatening to fold. I feared the cellar, feared the creature that dwells there. I'm past that now. I'm going to find her. Tonight, I'm going to go into the basement and settle this once and for all. My parents will likely find this, as well as my last poem. And if they do, I hope they send it to my editor so she can publish what will likely be my last work. I'm going in there. I'm going to bring Lisa out, or I'm going to die trying. I will have my dream girl.